Welcome, everyone, to the fourth session of Developing and Structuring Bankable Renewable Energy Projects in Africa. And for those of you who tried to get in this morning, I had a technical difficulty. It looks like it was related to my computer. There had been some software installed and the system needed to reload. And because it hadn't been restarted, essentially, it impacted a lot of other programs, including Adobe Flash. So that seems to have been my problem. We got it figured out. So we're all set for this afternoon. So I just want to welcome again anybody who did not, where this session is not a good time for them, to feel free to contact me. I've indicated via email that you can set up a 30-minute chat with me. And so that would then allow us to catch up with anything that you are unclear about. This is actually the fourth session, so I'm sure that you have some questions. If you don't, I hope that's a good thing. So anyways, let's get started with today's session. And today we're going to focus on, we're moving from looking at the different factors related to pulling together a project, and we're now going to look at the process and also the first document that you have to pull together, which is the project definition document. And it's really a document that lays out the parameters, the scope, the framework of your project, and it's the first externally communicated document in writing. And you'll see how today, how this particular document actually ties into all of the things that we've been talking about earlier today and how important it is for getting your project on the move. So let's first look at what our session is going to look like today. We are going to, again, just focus on two key areas: the project development process and the project definition document. First, we'll quickly review the Venture Logic Contextual and Content Analysis and Impact Tool, or Impact Matrix, actually. And then we'll move on to describing what the project development process looks like. Then we will look at defining and describing the importance of business models to projects. And just to give you a quick explanation of what a business model is, it's basically how you answer the question, how do we logically create value? And then the next item will be how to explain how the business model impacts the project development process. We'll also describe key considerations for renewable energy projects in the project development process. And we will define and describe elements of a project definition document. And finally, and this is really not anything that we cover in the webinar or in the workshop, but you will actually, as an assignment, begin to look at drafting an initial project development document. Now, when we look at this, again, we want to look at the project development process as our next key thing. But let's just go back for a moment and look at how we approach project development. We've spent actually the last 3 weeks, including the introductory week, really unpacking the different elements of what we call the contextual and content factors of a project. And again, this is just an image that shows you all the different pieces. We're not going to spend any time with this today. It's just a matter of, again, referencing you back to what we've already done. And then as we go through the next few slides, I'll then connect it to our project development process. You also know that we talked last week, or really the last couple of weeks, about the analysis and impact matrix. Elements, and then you can then consider, discuss, decide how each of those key issues in one element impacts all of the others. And as a reminder, this tool is actually up in the webinar folder so that you can download it. It's blank, which gives you a lot of freedom. As a reminder, this is not a tool that you want to get tied down or bogged down in, because essentially you have a lot of detail to manage and to look at. This is really to pull things out that begin to show themselves on your project. They can be positive, they can be negative, they can be open issues, things that you really think somehow you need to figure out how to work with it. You really don't know what it is yet, or you don't know how to address it as of yet. So this allows you in one place to put all of those issues or those items together and then begin to look at how they impact each other and how they interact. Now, from a practical perspective, in terms of managing the project development process or the management of your project, is that you don't want to do this every day all the time, because you can get very much caught up in the minutia of trying to just keep track of all of the content and contextual factors. This is really a tool that you will use as you are going along your process. For example, when you transition from a concept document, or let's say a pre-feasibility assessment, to planning your full feasibility, you'll then look at these things and say, okay, how are things looking at this point in time? I really use this as a snapshot more than a daily tool, again, just because of the level of interaction that you can get yourself caught up into. Another key point that you can use in terms of time that you can use to interact with this tool is once a month. Oftentimes you have to report out to stakeholders, or you have a monthly review of what's been going on with your project. So it's very easy to have the team or yourself just go through these items in discussion, or, updating their own documents and then compiling them together so that you keep track of things that are quite significant, could seem, or things that just seem to you that need to be dealt with. Or approached in a certain way. You can document that on the analysis and impact matrix. And again, as you're doing this and going through and using the content and contextual factors framework, it is allowing you now to pull out individual items, data, information, relationships, both formal and informal, tangible and intangible, to look at how you can configure projects for a sustainable business model. Now, this then, again, we have spent the last 3 weeks really focusing on the content and the context framework, because it really serves as the input for the process. So today we're going to be taking a look now first at the project development process. And what we have here is our venture logic, which is part of afribiz's methodology. But I believe that you'll also be able to see other relevant things in it that you can apply to other projects and that others may have communicated to you. All we're trying to do is give you one methodology that you can use. You can customize it. You can adapt it to your own use. But what we find is that by sharing what we are using, it helps you and helps you gain capacity. So a lot of what you're seeing, you're not getting like necessarily all of our tools in the webinar and extreme detail of stuff, but you are getting the process materials so that you will be capable of walking your own project through. That is really the key goal of this, so that you can begin to manage and facilitate your own projects. If you're a consultant, you can certainly use this, with educating your own clients. You can certainly use it, on any project that you want to use. What I tend to find is that between myself and others of our partners who want to use this, is that they follow the process. They use the tools, but they do, tweak it, because they have, they may be looking at a certain type of portfolio. They may not be as broad as we are. That's one of the reasons why this particular workshop is actually separate from our general workshop that's entitled Developing and Structuring Bankable Projects in Africa, because there's enough of a difference with renewable energy projects in terms of content, what it looks like, not necessarily the process, the high level process or the strategic level, or even the operational level. But, for someone who's doing their first project or first couple of projects, or, really wants to have all of the pieces come together for them, it's obviously more helpful to do it around your own project or your own specific area. So really, this is a tool that you can use very broadly. I think you'll also learn in general, when you're talking about doing any type of implementation of something new, that this can also be quite helpful. So basically, we have our project development process divided in two parts. We do apply this to both projects and ventures. Projects, I consider things that are very specific. It could be a company, and then they have a specific project. A venture to me is more of a new company, and there's a focus not on one specific project, although there may be one project to get the new venture started. So where we're going to start with this is we're actually going to start on our commitment phase. There's not much relevance any for you in terms of our connection phase. This is just what we do in order to begin to dialogue with people about working on projects or even partnerships. Now, commitment simply means that every group that you're coming into working relationship with is coming into an agreement where they are committing time, talent, resources, information to help one another in order to execute the project. Now, some of these things obviously will be very familiar with you for most of you. The first step is the NDA, and that's the non-disclosure agreement. Essentially what that's doing is saying that it is protecting every party's intellectual property and preventing one of the parties from working around another party. Now, in the context of Africa, in the U.S., we're very, 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 or in Western markets, we're very, very comfortable with putting a non-disclosure agreement in front of someone as soon as we just talk to them at the beginning. We say, okay, we need to have an NDA. We really can't tell you much. And, that's fine. We actually don't do that. We don't worry about the NDA until there's something significant that needs to be shared that really is private. And secondly, we just think that the NDA, if you start putting it into people's face right up front and you don't have any type of relationship, it actually can hamper your relationships at the beginning. So basically, we do mention oftentimes when we're introducing and talking to people that at some point we will have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, but we will work with them to determine when that is. And before, however, we can actually move to actually looking at developing a project, it is something that has to be accomplished. Now, after the NDA and probably really working together, there is a memorandum of understanding. And what that essentially says is that either, for example, between a government and the project developer or a project developer and a technical company, they have a common understanding of how they're going to work together. A memorandum of understanding is really a non-binding agreement. Okay, it allows parties to explore working together in order to develop a project in this particular case. Now, many of you will find that MOUs are used very differently in many different situations. In some situations, an MOU is actually binding. So MOUs are very flexible. How we use MOUs, however, is just to outlay the key objectives and goals of the relationship as it relates to the project. In cases where it's broader, we add that. Secondly, we use it as a means to say, okay, we are entering into a working agreement, even though right now it's not really formal, it's still informal. And we limit our MOUs when it's related to project development because we want to ensure that we're moving along at a decent pace and that we're not putting resources when the potential partners for the project are not really ready or willing to put in what needs to be. So this is almost like a dating type thing. You're getting to know one another. It's almost like you're going steady, but it's like you're new steady. You don't know them very well, but you think you like them. And so you want to see how you can work together or how you can date one another. So that's the best way I can explain it. And so what we do is we do look to get that before we start any major effort, even in commitment, in order to pull together a project. And so when we have that MOU, then our period of execution in terms of commitment in order to flush things out is typically about 3 months. If we're not able to pull enough information together, which tells us, how the partners will work together, for example, it tells us, how quickly they're able to get it, what their capacity looks like, how are we going to relate to one another. You can learn a lot in those first 3 months. After those 3 months, typically, we want to look at either how we can inform changes so that we can actually move forward, or we might have to cut our losses at that time. This is one of those areas where we'll talk about later about making go-no-go decisions. And this is one of those stages. At this point, you've already actually put in and invested in that relationship. You're going to, over that 3 months, probably, I'm just giving you an average, probably dedicate about 80 hours to 120 hours if it's on a project and is dealing with a significant partner, either a project developer, if you're not a project developer, if you're working with a technical partner, or if you're working with a group like the government or someone who has land, you're actually going to invest quite a bit of time. So, and let me say that might be a little bit high, but I think this process entirely with all of the key partners ends up being about 80 to 120 hours. And so it just really depends on project to project, the size, the scope, where it is. For example, are you local or are you, having to come in from a different country? But it is very important to really use this as an opportunity to build relationships, to identify gaps that may occur in the process, and see if you can find ways to mitigate them and to mitigate the associated risks. I'm not trying to pick on government, but government is a good example in many of these cases. If it's a project that is like a public-private partnership where government is working with private sector, and for many governments, and it's just the nature of government, they're quite bureaucratic. So something that we think is simple that can be done in 2 days might take a month. And so this is how you learn all of these things, is by, having this trial period where you are investing time and effort, but you are not necessarily, exclusive to the project. You haven't put intensive resources in terms of people time. I mean, one person can actually work on this part-time and maybe even quarter time once they get more efficient with the project development process. And this is something that we, really work with our project associates, is in this process of how to manage these little things so that basically you can be very efficient and cost effective. You're not, you want to give life to the project, so you have to obviously provide input, put enough sufficient resources so things can get done. But at the same time, there are many things that you can learn to mitigate the waste and the time and the inefficiency that's related to early stage project investment. Now, to me, for example, early stage projects are iterative in nature. They're not very linear. You're always going back in order to fill up your business model. So to me, that's not actually wasted time. So later on, we will define the difference between wasted time and, what we call efficiency. So then once you have the MOU, you are also going to look at doing some type of literal agreement that is a binding contract. Now, for us, overall, the way that we work and interact, we often do a joint project development agreement where all the key stakeholders come together. It's not a joint venture per se, but it's an agreement on how we're going to develop the project. A joint venture, for example, may be a result of the project being developed, being bankable and getting financial close, and then a joint venture is formed as a result of the project being, receiving funding. So basically, though, this is a binding agreement that says this is who's in this and who's responsible for what. You may not have every single party. You might actually have different project development agreements. You might have one, if you're the project developer, between yourself and the technical team, between yourself, and the landholder, all sorts of different things depending on the model that you're going to structure your project around. Now, in reality, the project development agreement, we do want that at the end of that 3 months. The MOU is at the beginning before we start any major work in order to collect information, develop relationships, begin to really chart out how we're going to do the project. So the joint project development agreement should be the result of you executing an MOU and then pulling together a project definition document, okay? And again, that joint project development agreement or a key agreement may not precisely happen during commitment. It may actually happen as a part of the concept project development stage, and I will talk about that momentarily, so it's more clear. So essentially, what you're doing is you're basically getting a commitment and agreement. Now, as it relates to renewable energy projects, a very good example of an agreement that should be executed as soon as possible is for the site. A land agreement, land use agreement, like if it's solar, it's wind, you need land in order to do that. If it's related to biomass, not only do you need land, typically you also need the feedstock. So it might be a feedstock agreement and a land agreement. So depending on the type of project, whether it's energy versus light scale industrial, the agreements will be different because each different sector requires different things, but they all typically follow a very similar process. So when we go into this stage and we've executed the MOU, you are really beginning to use the venture logic framework, particularly the content and the contextual factors. What you're going to do is you're going to start going through each one of those different 22 dimensions and basically drafting. You'll see that as we go through the different components, as we go into more detail, you'll see that we have a set of questions or things that you should be looking for each one of those. And so there are some guidelines, but basically what you end up doing is you go through and you then decide, what is key for that particular project. So you have your own framework, an adapted framework for each project. And so that's a tool. Those inputs that you should start looking at this stuff right away as it pertains to a potential project. In particular, what's going to be of interest to you is that in the project definition, you will start pulling together or referencing questions that you're answering in the venture logic comprehensive dimension. And that, again, is the high level. Okay, it should reveal the business model, which we'll talk more about later. And it comes from the detail in the other 21 dimensions. So obviously, I also suggest that you have a standard NDA template, an MOU draft that you can quickly, or your key partners can quickly fill out and respond with. Also, a project development agreement template, and also the project definition template. We are not, going to go through the NDA, the MOU, or the PDA, but we are going to share with you later today key elements so that you can build your own project definition template. And so again, just to summarize, your outputs should be an NDA, actually, a project development agreement of some sort. Again, with renewable energy, typical ones might be a land agreement or a feedstock agreement. You may even come across situations where you get a power purchase agreement in the early stages, or at least a non-binding agreement to such effect. Okay? And so basically now you're going to see these many things start coming together. Now, once you've gotten through the commitment phase, again, you have a project definition. And what is the project definition? The project definition, again, is really a framework that outlines the scope, the parameters, assumptions, constraints, key factors that are a part of the project. It is not, however, the business model. The business model speaks of the value that you create. Okay, there's a difference. The project definition is almost an internal or technical view of what the different elements. The concept document is where you pull together now the business model, which actually is a configuration of all the elements that you may have expressed in the project definition, all of the many different variables that you look at in the context and contextual framework that we give with venture logic. Okay, so again, this is a critical point. The project definition document has to be done, because you'll find that key partners, financial institutions, and others won't even give you the time of day unless you have something documented. And this is really the first step. We'll talk about this in more detail today because we are covering it in this session. So let's continue now and take a look at the concept project development stage. Within this, we then have the concept document. And again, the concept document is really where you highlight your business model, which is, what is the value that we create, which simply means, how is our business going to be sustained? Okay. And so the input to this is the project definition. Okay. And also the venture logic, content, and contextual factors, because those things will continue throughout the process to feed and serve as inputs and even feedback to some degree into the different documents that are developed along the project development horizon. Once you have the concept document, then you now begin to move into pre-feasibility. And how I define pre-feasibility, it's actually quite broad. When I look at pre-feasibility, I'm looking at anything that you can do before you have to invest major funds, incur significant risk, and also, before you essentially have to have a refined, look at the project. Now, what happens is, between project definition, concept document, the pre-feasibility assessment, and even feasibility planning, it is very iterative, okay? Because you're trying to flesh out, bring into fullness each and every single part of the business model, okay? And all of that requires a very iterative process. And you will find that you will maybe one week work on something and you really get it going good, and then you work another week on something else. Then others kind of work on everything at the same time. But it's really iterative. There is no formula. There are frameworks as it is for putting together concept documents and pre-feasibility materials. Now, of course, there are templates and things that you can use so you understand how it should be structured. Your document should be structured, the things that you look for. And that's all a part of what we're doing here with this particular workshop. So then, of course, you have feasibility planning. You want to know what you're going to be doing to prove your concept. Another way to think of a feasibility study is that it is a pilot of something that you're going to execute. It is verifying that it will work as you have defined your solution or your business. And oftentimes, as much as possible, in projects in general, you try to have something very tangible. Now, with energy projects, that's, you can't like just build a plant, and then, test and whatever, and then move on. So basically, this has to do with having proven technologies, having proven systems and processes in order to prove out your business model. Okay? Now, after that, you have a go-no-go review. But as I briefly mentioned before, go-no-go reviews should really be going on all throughout this process, because you want to ensure that you can cut losses, minimize risk, also manage cost, and also improve efficiency. So after you do an iteration, you might ask yourself, after you've tested that iteration, looked at it, okay, is this suitable? Do we want to move on to the next stage? What's probably more practical is to do it based on when you are, which phase you're working on. So, for example, after you finish the project definition, your team, ask yourself, is this something we want to continue with? Because you have identified constraints, you've probably identified gaps or challenges, and you may decide, you know what, there are too many, or there are challenges and gaps that we cannot handle at this time. So instead of moving further and putting extra resources into it, you can stop. And typically, I always have the situation that I never look at a project as having failed or lost. I just say that it's on hold for the moment until we can find a solution that will work. Now, it's interesting if it's related to technology. I've heard stories of people where they have a great plan, but it's 10 years ahead of its time, so the technology hasn't caught up. So then all of a sudden they pull this stuff out, old projects, and they find that they've got something that's very workable. Obviously, it has to be adapted. So I don't ever look at a project as something that has wasted my time unless I have not managed it well. If I didn't manage it well, then that's a whole nother story. Because I can cut my losses, I can determine, whether I move forward or whether I stop. So that go-no-go decision should also be looked at, at the end of the concept document, at the end of the pre-feasibility assessment, even after the feasibility planning, because with the feasibility planning, you then know how much it's going to cost. So if you have a budget that you're thinking of, but you find out based on your solution that it's beyond what you can do or what you can acquire in terms of resources, it might be something that you have to put on hold. And then, of course, after the feasibility pilot, you then have to decide, is this something that can make bankable so that we can move forward? So basically what you're going to use as tools is, again, venture logic, both the framework, content and contextual framework, and elements of our development process, the project definition document that you put together earlier. And then, you will have developed for yourself a concept document outline against which you will begin to pull together the business model. And the same thing with the feasibility study outline. With all of the different factors that we, look at, what you can do is you can find samples of feasibility studies, around the internet all the time. And then you can take what was done and, develop an outline and then find out, through the frameworks, are there pieces that are missing that you think need to be in there? And again, some of the things that we ask, some of the questions you may find, well, for my context, that doesn't make any sense. I don't need to ask that. And that's fine. That's why we always indicate that you want to adapt what we're giving you. We're giving you a process and a methodology that allows you to be more efficient, more cost effective, better capacitized to manage the actual project development. Okay, so, in including to that is the stakeholder analysis tools, which we'll talk about. I think it's about 2 weeks out. And basically, these are things that you have to begin to look at very early on, because the relationships will really drive the execution of the project. Even when you have money, people will tell you in Africa, you can have money and still not get a project done. And you're, going around in circles. So, looking and working with relationships is a key thing. So that's something we've actually pulled out as a separate piece so that, people who are developing projects or those that are affiliated with projects that are being developed can actually learn how to manage those and work with them and flow with them. Some of the thing is culture. I think often, when I work with many people in Africa, and it's not necessarily those who've worked in corporate settings or in large companies, but they're very capable. Okay, they actually can communicate. They understand it's not really a problem, or they learn quickly. The issue becomes when you ask to have things written down, and this is one of the issues why we're doing this workshop, so that both sides understand the dynamics that are going on. Basically, everything in the West, you need a document, okay? And they like as much detail as you can provide, particularly if they are funding you. And so if you're not well documented, your story, your business cannot be sold. So this is why we are going through this process to ensure that all parties understand that and understand all that has to go on to make that happen. But secondly, if you are used to the culture where written documents and detailed written documents is the norm, you have to then begin to learn to work with the dynamics in a culture where things are still quite oral. They like face-to-face interaction. They like to speak what's going on, not necessarily write it down. I have found many people, for example, when I'm working with them, they can give me detail after detail and detail, but it's not written down. So I'm the one who has to write it down. So when you're thinking about forming a team or forming, a partnership with a local partner, these are some of the simple cultural things that you need to be aware of and begin to work with. So in our case, for example, if we're working on a project, we don't necessarily have a problem doing the writing. We do, again, as part of that commitment phase and working on figuring out how we work together, that's how we can put a plan on how to deal with stakeholders. Because we haven't put tons of investment in it, we can, adapt very quickly in the early stages to ensure that we're able to get the information and the participation and the expertise that we need from all sides. And that's really critical in order to get a project to bankability. And these little things can actually be things that create the risk and the cost associated with projects because there are a lot of unknowns. Sometimes the technology, that's the easy part because, financiers are looking for you to provide a proven technology. And so, even though you have to do feasibility and you have to do assessments, that is, to me, one of the more tangible sides of project development. But there are all of these soft issues or, gray areas that need to be managed. And this is, I think, where many teams, whether they're from the West or from Africa, they're either on one side or another side or other perspective, and they cannot work with all of the contexts. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to draw those pieces together so that there's some type of balance and harmony. So once the project development stage is done, then you will have had a concept document, your pre-feasibility assessment, and that's really what we call a project information memorandum. That is, it'll be preliminary. A project information memorandum typically comes out and goes to the financial people. That's obviously after you have a bankable project, and it communicates to them enough information in order for them to figure out if they want to engage with you concerning your project. But what we have looked at is how you can use that structure to begin to communicate all throughout the process. And so what we recommend is doing what we call a preliminary project information memorandum that basically documents all of the key elements in enough detail so your team and even others who are looking at this, it could be an EPC, an engineering procurement contractor, they'll know what's going on so they can ask more intelligent questions. It also reveals a lot about your project. As you update it, people will see how it's developing. And people who are kind of on the fence about whether to work with you or not, you can use that as a great communication tool. Now, of course, not everyone's going to read that level of detail every single time. So you have to, again, look at your stakeholders, look at the type of audience, look at what they, how much information they can take. And then, of course, you can always do a presentation. You can always do a quick phone call and say, listen, we've changed some things. These are some of the dynamics. We are now at this stage. I'm going to send you the preliminary project information memorandum, just if you want to look at more detail. They don't have to read it, but you can offer it. So all of these things become very important in your process. And really, you're moving from a very vague idea, when you start with the project definition, to a bankable project when you have finished the feasibility and it's bankable, and you now are moving into what we call configuration. Now, you, at the end of a feasibility study, typically you will know whether or not something is bankable. You will know if there are gaps that, exist, and then you'll have to figure out if you can address them in order to make it bankable. So basically at that point, this is the first real key, big, red, important milestone in the project is that go, no-go decision at this time. You have to decide if all of the things that you've invested, and by this time, most of you know you would have spent quite a bit of money, on a feasibility in order to bring the project to execution. Now, I'm just giving you one scenario. This is not, necessarily, Bible, meaning, you know, formal, but typically, whatever the cost of a renewable energy project, the feasibility will be 1%, maybe 2% of that total cost. So, for example, if it's a $100 million project, the feasibility will cost anywhere from $1 million to $2 million. And of course, it has a lot to do with the complexity and the different parts. So, when you think about that, that's quite a bit of money for a project developer who is not going to be making money from this, for possibly 2 to 3 years. So these are decisions that you have to account for. And, at that point, if you've put in all that money, definitely, typically, you're going to want to, at all costs, see if you can't finalize in order to make it bankable. So once you've gone through that process, then you go to configuration, where you do refine it until you know that it's actually bankable. And then once you have done that refinement, then you actually go about and you develop the packaging that is going to be presented to investors, financiers, and perhaps key partners. Okay, and as a part of that process, you will have the tools that you use will be, again, Venture Logic. It's still very relevant. All of the content and contextual details. Your updated PEM. At this point, you will have a project information memorandum that is well on its way to being, I wouldn't say final because that's not the word right, but it's final in that you're beginning to transition out of, early and middle stages to late stage project development. Okay. And then you will, of course, be interacting with the business plan template and also developing a presentation or a pitch for the investor and funders and also key partners. For example, could be doing a pitch to an EPC, because EPCs typically do not like to come in early. They actually like to see bankable projects, just like financiers. And that actually, let me just make a quick point, that kind of creates a catch-22, because in order to get EPCs interested, not EPCs, financiers interested in your project, you need an EPC that's experienced. So, so you kind of go around in circles, and that's what really breaks through that is trust, which is developed through relationship. So that's why we emphasize relationship and stakeholders so much, because there's a lot that people will, allow to happen if they trust you, if you're in a good relationship, versus if you're just someone, cold who's coming and saying, we want you to do this with us. Okay. And so the outputs of the configuration is an updated business model, obviously, that's contained within the Bankable project. You'll have a business plan, you'll have that investor partner presentation, and also supporting project documentation. I mean, they need to have your company registration, they need to have the copy of the share certificates, they need to have copies of the feasibility, they need to have credit references, for example, for different things. I mean, there's a lot of documentation. So that is all a part of that configuration process. Then once you have those pieces together, you can now move to capacitization, which includes funding, investment, resource acquisition. It also can involve, and should really involve, planning and resource mobilization. After you spent so much time working on developing a project and you're close to financial close, you don't want to have another 6 months of trying to ramp up and implement. So you want to try and put resources into anticipating that you're going to move into implementation. Okay. And if you looked at this, in terms of timing, you'll see that, from in the project venture development phase, you will see that, we have anywhere from 3 months to a year, 3 months to a year, 3 months to a year. That can be related to the size of the project, who you're working with. If you've done some upfront work, for example, like with financial institutions, so that basically when you give them your bankable project, when you have the plan and everything's together, they've already seen a lot of stuff. So it's just a matter of them determining if they're going to be able to work with it. Now, in reality, probably what I should say is that capacitization really is typically no less than 6 months. Okay, so by the time you finish all of this cycle, you are really looking anywhere from 18 months to 3 years easily, just getting through project development. However, as you become better at doing projects and this process, you will begin to see how you can accelerate. And as we go through this, we will be talking about some best practices, lessons learned, so that you can also accelerate faster than we accelerated. You can learn from our mistakes and our failures. And, again, one of the things you'll find that with project development, I never really consider a project that doesn't get bankable. And I know this is probably, everyone is like, they don't want to hear this, but I don't consider it a failure. Obviously you've invested a lot of, if you've gone through feasibility, even pre-feasibility, you've put a lot of effort into these things. But what I see is that in each instance, I get closer to getting the project that I want. And that's why it's important really to really get as much as you can in pre-feasibility, so you haven't spent the larger bucks, the larger money in doing a feasibility. Because what happens is failure, I love this quote, I'm sorry I don't remember who said it, but failure is actually feedback. And that's really the nature of business modeling or project development. It's iterative in nature. You keep trying, you keep working until you get the right business model that's going to be sustainable. And that's when you then can move and then have something that's considered bankable. Okay, great. So when we talk about this particular workshop, we are really focusing on anywhere from the project definition, which starts in the commitment stage, and really going through the concept project development phase, not so much in terms of teaching you how to do a feasibility, because that's more technical, but basically the process and the key tools and supporting things that you need to be able to manage in project development. The practicum that we have will actually then, again, allow you to practice in detail all of the steps that we've talked about, and will then also take you through basically configuration as well. And as a part of the practicum, then you actually are speaking to funders, key partners. There's that matching process in the practicum. Not all of you will choose to do that. That's totally fine. But I'm just trying to show you in relationship to what you're learning, what's going on, and how you can use what you're learning now. Okay, so, when we're talking about this thing with project development, we need to be clear on a few things. And I've said things like the business model, and I mentioned iterative, but it doesn't really sink in, because what I find most of the time is people assume that, financing comes very easily. They get a business plan and, and they think it's a good idea, so it should be easy to get financed. Okay, even if you need a little bit of money, $100,000, it can be very difficult to get money. It's amazing the amount of effort you have to put in, even just getting in a little amount. So it's very important to understand the difference between development and execution. First off, projects are executed based on a master design or blueprint. That's typically what the EPC does. He takes the plan, and they've obviously also participated in detailing all of that, and then they build it. They construct it. Then an operator comes in. Project development is about developing the master design or blueprint. That means by nature it is iterative, it is vague when you start, and it's about making steps and fleshing out different parts of the business model in order to have a bankable project. That master plan that you're developing starts with the business model. Project development and business model development are iterative in nature. And the example that I like to use for this is a kaleidoscope. If you've ever looked into a kaleidoscope, you know that you keep turning it and you get different patterns. And what makes that work is that they're different pieces. I don't know what the materials might be, but they're different colors, different shapes. And when they refract light coming through and against the mirror, they create these different patterns. And why I consider this to be somewhat like, playing or using a kaleidoscope is that you keep turning the kaleidoscope to see different patterns. you keep iteratively reworking the business model to find the desired pattern. Okay? And so it's not something that you have a hard step, oh, I've got this and that's it. Now I can move on to the next thing. It is really iterative. It's a maturing process. It's almost like a child, when it's a baby, it doesn't do much on its own. It doesn't stand on its own. But when the child is 18, 21, they should be able to stand very independently. That's the same thing with the business model. The business model is in your head, the idea is in your head. At the end of it, that business model should be able to stand on its own, showing that it is competitive, that it provides value to your stakeholders. Okay? And so it's like you are cultivating or nurturing that business model through this process by the work that you do in order to make it a sustainable business model. Okay? So let me just now detail more about what a business model is, because we will be talking about this throughout, but in particular, we're doing it this week, and I believe next week and probably the following week, there'll be different elements that we're interfacing with, but it will all center around the business model. So again, a business model is how do you logically create that value? And Johan Wallen in Business Orchestration actually gave a detailed definition. A business model defines the value creation priorities of an actor in respect to the utilization of both internal and external resources. To me, it sounds like value chain, right? From the energy source all the way to the end user. It defines how the actor relates with stakeholders such as actual and potential customers, employees, unions, suppliers, competitors, and other internal groups. Okay? It takes account of situations where the actor's activities may affect the business environment and its own business in ways that create conflicting interests or impose risks on the actor. Okay? But what is really relevant to us is B, develop new, previously unpredicted ways of creating value. And so every project is a new way of creating value. Now, hopefully the goal is, and I think this is, my variation on this definition, is that you do want to be able to predict ways of creating value with things that are non-competitive. For example, okay, you know that you need to have the right technology. You know that you need to have the right processes. You then need to figure out, and it could be technology, it could be your process, things in addition that are going to create that unique value proposition, and we will talk about that a little bit later. What is the central question for a business model? Very simply, how do we fulfill our purpose to serve our clients in a sustainable way while making profits and sharing the benefits with our shareholders? Now, let's begin to look at, key questions that you're answering in developing your business model. And in this, I'm going to use an example. Let's use a biomass plant that is about 30 megawatts, just very general. Okay, who are our customers? Well, what we're advising is that you have an off-taker, like government or private company, because off-taker agreements are easier to get financed if there's proper structuring, as long as the off-taker is credible and can pay and all of that stuff. So in this example, who are our customers? Let's say it's the government. What do we offer each of our customer segments? Let's keep it simple. Let's say electricity. And in this case, we are giving the power to the government on the grid, and then they actually then distribute it to end users like businesses and residences. Okay? How do we relate to our customers over time? Now, that is going to be for a renewable energy project that has a power purchase agreement. That's actually going to probably be documented in a very formal way. So, power purchase agreements on average are 20 years, maybe 30 years, maybe shorter. And in that, it does actually talk about how you're going to relate. What are you going to do? What are they going to do? If you all are happy, then this is what you'll do together. If you're not happy, then this is how we're going to deal with that. But there's also a non-formal or an informal aspect to this. This is about how are you going to relate to the people in relationship. This is something that is not necessarily documented adequately or systematized. When you're talking about developing and working with relationships, it doesn't hurt to have some systematic process around you for managing that. That doesn't mean it becomes a machine thing, an automatic thing. For example, you might put in your task database, okay, we're working on this project. I just need to reach out to this person in government once a month just to see how they're doing. Maybe have coffee with them. And again, this is just about relationship. It's not about getting undue advantage, but it's relationship. You need relationship in order to get projects done in Africa and even outside of Africa, no matter what people tell you. Okay, what key activities are involved in running the business? Well, okay, first you have to collect the energy source. Okay, if it's a sun or wind, that's relatively easy, right? But what if it's biomass? You need to collect it, maybe need to sort it. You then need to convert it so that it can be used as input for the energy. You then produce the energy, then it's output, then it needs to be distributed. Okay, so that's an example. It's really kind of your value chain in the process. Who will be the people groups responsible for the key activities involved in running the business? Again, for example, if it's a power plant, once it's implemented, you're probably going to have an operator. So that's a key group that is going to be responsible for a key activity. If you are doing biomass projects where you are interfacing and allowing the locals, which is a great idea, and I always suggest wherever you can find inclusive business opportunities, they can collect the waste, the wood, and bring it to a collection point where it's sorted and then prepared to be used, as input for the energy production. And so basically, you need to understand all of that in order to explain your business model. What are the outputs from the key activities involved in running the business? Okay, obviously it's electricity. What resources do we use to run the business? Okay, that could include the equipment, that could include the turbines, it can include, office personnel. I'm sorry, no, not resources. That's related to the people and the groups. And then, resources could even be financial. They're anything, again, resources are the things that are inputs or things that are used as the methods. How can I put it? They're part of the process. They're things, they're inputs into the process. They're not necessarily the initial inputs, but they're things that help transform the raw materials into the output that you're creating. In this case, it's electricity. With whom do we partner, align, or collaborate? Okay, again, in this example, you will have an EPC who is going to do the engineering, procurement, and construction, who will then hand off to an operator. Those are very typical entities that you will partner with. And then what and who do we use to reach our customers? In this case, it's very easy. It'll be with the government, for example. It'll be a grid connection. So they will have to provide you the grid connection so that you can put the electricity on their grid, and then they will be responsible for distributing it to the end user. What are the key costs? Again, I think this is very obvious. There's a cost to operating, construction, development, running the business, distribution, all of those, power, your own power to keep the plant going. So all of those costs need to be, documented. And then, of course, how do we generate revenue? Again, that's very easy. Here, you probably have a power purchase agreement with the government, and they're going to give you a standard price with, indicating how much and how often, in terms of quantity, in terms of power, whether they're going to take all of your 30 megawatts or they're going to do 10 megawatts, are there going to be peak times, all of those different variables. And so all of these questions then should lead you to being able to state very simply, what is your unique value proposition? Well, most technical people would say the fact that you now have power when you didn't have it before. Okay. But that's not, I mean, that's good. Okay. And I'm not saying that that's not valid, because it could be. That's, when it's a place where they haven't had it and no one is about getting it done and able to get it done, hey, that's a unique value proposition. But a unique value proposition, think when you're trying to pull together a sustainable business model, don't think about a model that just works because you have no competition. There's nothing there. A sustainable business model works whether or not you have competition. And that's where you really need to look at how you define what your business model is. Because again, that is going to be what financiers and bankers, they're going to ask you these questions. So as an example, okay, unique value proposition. Well, we are using a method not only in terms of technology, but we have a system now where we can educate and train locals to run the plant, so that after 3 years, we no longer, all of the operations are done locally. Okay. That is a good value proposition for Africa. They want to build capacity. They want to build local capacity. They want to develop, economic opportunities locally. And there are a lot of other things that you can add, but that's just hopefully a simple example. Now, what is a value proposition? Just very simply, we won't spend time here really getting into that. We'll do that in the next session when we talk more about the concept document. It's an innovation, a service, or featured intended to make a company, product, or service attractive to customers. Okay? So, how does this business model then, what we've been talking about, interact with venture logic? First, the business model questions are central to the venture logic comprehensive dimension. If you remember, I think it was in the first week, basically, I laid out the 30 or so questions related to the comprehensive view, which really is the input for your concept documents, okay, which is undergirded by the detail that you have in all of the other 21 categories, okay? And so if you looked at the questions, if you compare the questions between what we've listed for the comprehensive dimension and the business model, you'll see that the key business model questions are actually embedded in the comprehensive questions, okay? So they're not separate. It's really the same list. For our purposes, comprehensive is an expansion of those key questions that are asked as it relates to a business model. Also, the dimensions of the venture logic context and content framework are inputs to the business model. I've already mentioned that. The dimensions serve to assist you in building each part of your business model. Very simply, those dimensions that have key points or questions for each one of them serve almost as a checklist or an outline for you to think about and look at and investigate and pull together the different parts of your business model, okay? The first output tied directly to the business model is not the project definition that we're speaking of today. I've mentioned this before. It is actually the concept document. And that is what shows the actual sustainable business model. That's what you're moving from. Today, we're talking about the project definition. The next week, we'll be talking about concept documents. So what are some tips for the project development process? You want to get to something tangible as soon as possible. And I'll mention this just a little bit later. A good example is getting a land agreement or a feedstock agreement and getting those locked in. Because basically, if you don't have a site and if you don't have feedstock on a renewable energy project, you really don't have a project. And so that's important, because if you want to start pulling in key partners, having financiers look at it, they need to see these things, and the site really is the number one thing before they'll even really talk to you. Now, again, if you have grace and if you have relationship, people will help you out, okay? And some people who don't even know you will help you out. But really, they can't take you seriously until you have some things done. And so that is one of the key things. Get something tangible as soon as possible. You want to keep costs down by developing one element at a time, flushing out as much as possible. And really that says is, once you have your project definition and you have actually even pulled your concept document together, you can then use that as a means to develop in detail through pre-feasibility and even feasibility the different parts of the business model. Many iterations instead of one grand move. There's no other way. That's what you do with project development. That's what you do with business, with developing business models in order to develop a master plan. Okay? Focus on increasing value and minimizing risk. This should be at, this is like a mantra. You keep it at the top, because when you talk to key partners, when you talk to key stakeholders, when you talk to financial people, when you talk to the EPC, okay, this is what they're going to be looking for. And if you remember in the first session, we showed the curve of where the risk, comes in, and the risk starts coming in between, just really about when you do the full feasibility, but the value also increases, and the risk, starts going down as you do more. Okay, make go no go decisions at every step. I've already indicated why and gave you an examples, and then be able to cut your losses if necessary. And also, in this, you want to learn how to manage the entire process yourself during the early stages, and even really throughout. Now, I want to make a note, okay? I am not against consultants. We consult. That's not our primary business model. In past years, I have consulted. But the model of consulting that I prefer and recommend is not, it's still using an expert, but the expert actually walks you through, and places where you have gaps, then they fill in. Okay. So the thing is that why this is important is this really, one, the responsibility on that project is you have to know that project. Okay, if it's your project. Now, if you are a landowner who just wants to develop it and you give the responsibility to someone else, that's totally different. Okay, but if you have a key stake in the project, you're putting your own resources into it, you definitely want to know what's going on with the process and have a handle on it. It doesn't mean that you yourself are doing it, but that you have someone who has the capacity to do this throughout. There's, again, another cost factor. When we talk about getting the project definition done, okay, someone was telling me, and it was a large project, and it was, it was a large project. It was probably a more complicated one, and so they were telling me that it was going to cost $30,000 to $50,000 just to do the project definition. Okay, and again, I'm not against paying consultants, but that is actually a lot of money for something that is not even a project at that point, because typically with the project definition, you may or may not have a site. Well, you do need to have a site, but it's so early on in the process, so that's actually quite a bit of money. So it would be better if you could manage that, collect the information, consult with the consultant or the expert, and have them oversee the detail, but you take responsibility for that, and then you can cut back on the fees. Again, you're always going to have opportunity to spend money. That is one thing that I know already. Okay. And if you have money and you just want to get it done, I totally agree with you. You can call us. We have no problem. I'm sure anyone else who has that capacity has no problem doing that for you. But again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop a process that can be used by everyone, whether you're using a consultant, whether you need to do and manage it yourself, or somewhere in between, or if you're on the technical side, but you need to understand what the rest are. We want to have, one pathway. And no, you are going to have to spend money. That is not, there are ways to, alter and adapt and work with people. We'll talk about that, in terms of alternative financing of early stage and project development. But basically, you do have to spend money, and you have to be ready for that. This is one of the key issues that comes up against projects, because there's not money to do the project development. I've seen many projects that are actually really good. I mean, they'll be great projects once they're proven out, but they're sitting waiting on feasibility funding. So this is another reason why we're doing the project development workshop, because if you go through it and you go through the practicum, you would have done as much as you could have done on your project. making it better, right? And then when you interact with financial institutions and investors, um, they can see that you have a very, as much as you've done all you could do. Now, that doesn't mean that they will necessarily fund you at that time, because still very few, we're working with the IDC, they do projects that way, but it's still very few. So there's not actually enough what we would call early stage project development funds available, to put on projects, or not even early stage, just project development funds. Okay. Typically, project developers have to put that in themselves. But what happens is, after you do one project and you do it successfully, and you've had financial institutions or you've had investors, and they see that you have a pipeline of projects, they might actually then begin to put money into your early stage or middle stage in feasibility, or in project development overall. I've seen that. There are a couple companies that are now, they've developed a model. They're servicing companies. They go in as a service provider. They've done 2 or 3 projects that they've, done their own funding for project development. Now they're able to go out and get, financial institutions and investors to bring the money on their projects, so that they don't have to do it, because they have a proven system, they have a proven history, they now have relationships with those folks who are then willing to take more risks, because they say, oh, okay, you got another 10 projects, you got another 12 projects. Okay. And, in their case, they got, a system. They're very similar projects. They're not really diverse. It's heating and cooling is one example. And so therefore, even though each project is different, the mechanisms, the systems, all of that are very much the same. So that gives investors and financiers and even key partners a sense of minimized risk compared to what would normally be done with project development. So managing your entire process is really your responsibility. If you're the project developer or you're a key partner, whatever your scope is, you want to make sure that that is working as well as possible, and that you are interfacing with other key stakeholders appropriately. Okay, so now let's take a look at specifically developing a business model for renewable energy projects. And here we're just going to, the concepts and the things that we've done, the frameworks are all relevant. Whether you're doing renewable energy for the most part, whether you're doing a light scale manufacturing. But what we want to do is we want to take a closer look at those things that are important for renewable energy products. First off, what makes a project? A physical site. I've already mentioned this. Until you have a site that can be analyzed and all of that, basically, no one really considers that a project. You may consider it. It may be something internal that you consider as a project, but externally, pretty much it is not a project. And so this is why this first step is very important. The other key milestones for renewable energy besides site is that you need to have an engineering assessment. That can be part of the project definition, from project definition actually to the concept, from the project definition all the way through the pre-feasibility. You want to have your off-taker. Again, those are better than open market opportunities. You want to have access and permission. Now, access and permission can be formal. It can be the permits, the licenses that you need to operate, for example, or to do construction. But it can also be cultural things. Are you engaging properly with the environment, with the culture, with community, with the different stakeholders? Because those soft things can actually impact, your project. Is it the appropriate technology solution? Do you have an experienced team? Do you have the capital and finance? Okay, now when we look at many of these things, these are very obvious things. What we've done, again, this is just another way of looking at it. When you've got all of these milestones in order, you have the core of what could be a bankable project. But again, you need to look at things from a unique value proposition and look at all the different factors in the content and contextual factor in order to really build a sustainable business model. These are the core things that you want to do, but not all of the things that you want to address. So now let's take a look at the project definition document. one of the things is that a project definition document, again, is a framework. It provides the scope. It provides the parameters of what your project is. Basically, the project definition is going to answer these questions. Is it a greenfield project? Is it an enhancement or expansion, or is it a retrofit? What are the potential energy sources? What is the type and amount of products produced at the plant? What are the prerequisites for the project? And if it's a retrofit, what are its objectives? Okay, now let's break this down. The first is, actually that's the same thing, sorry. Products produced: electricity, steam, oxygen, nitrogen, heating. These are typical products produced. There may be other byproducts, for example, from the waste. There could be, with coal and how it's used, you could, develop some chemicals as a byproduct. So basically, you want to have an idea of what different products is. Just like, for example, what is your product or service offering? If it is a retrofit, here are some typical objectives: reduce operating and maintenance costs, increase plant efficiency, increase availability, reduce environmental impact, increase unit life, increase electricity production, and also, as we talked about before, you could possibly produce other products. Now, when we look at this, you have general prerequisites. When you're looking at this, the first one is talking about the type of project. And this means, is it a commercial project or is it for development? Now, commercial means obviously it's going to be a viable project that is going to be funded by the payment of customers. Development means that it could be, a proven technology, for example, but it's really, it's more of like an internal project. You're working something out, and it's not really driven by the commercialization. Okay, and so when the projects we're talking about really are going to be the commercial projects, just so you know. Now, it's really interesting when we look at some of these things, because when a lot of times I get people who have technology that's great, and they say it can do this, and you get excited, and then you find out that it's not commercial yet. And so they need a project to help make it commercial. And in order to get funding, you need a technology that's proven. So there's really this gap between research and development, even late stage research and development, when it's really ready for commercialization. It's hard to get the commercial investors and funders. In fact, it's virtually impossible. So again, you need to know where you are in your process, what your technology is, because all of this impacts whether or not you are able to get your project funded. And, the first thing I would tell people is, if it's not commercial, don't even bring it to me. If we have funds, for example, where we can help do a demo site and do that, or do it on an existing project, yes, we can look at that. But, I won't even talk to people about a commercial project with technology that has not been proven. Often people will come with technology and they say, well, Africa can benefit from this. Well, yeah, Africa can, but, they don't want to be your guinea pig. They want something that works, okay? They already have enough issues to deal with. They want proven technologies. And if you can prove it, Africa's a great market. Other than that, I would say that you need to work with a research institution. If you want to do it in Africa, it's fine, but it really needs to be more of a pilot site or a demonstration site to prove it out and move it to commercialization. Okay, so when we talk about the power plant, some of the characteristics include the size, the number of units, like the number of turbines, for example, the site, the location, and the available space for it. You then have to think of the energy source. Is it wind? Is it solar? Is it biomass? Is it geothermal? Is it coal? Is it gas? Okay, and then for each one of those, You need to then figure out, for example, is it domestic? Is it domestically available? Are you importing it? Now, again, typically you're not going to be importing biomass, or you're not importing wind or energy. But if you're doing things that are not renewable, like coal, for example, it could be imported. Okay. Then, as a part of that, you need to know the characteristics of the energy source. So, for sun, for example, or solar, it's the radiation. Is the radiation in that area appropriate? Will it work with the solution that you have? And all of those things, particularly, around the energy source, you're going to have to actually probably get some technical assistance. So that means that there is typically money that has to be paid for these types of things. And then, of course, another prerequisite is, when is the plant going to be commissioned? Okay. Next, we have economic prospects, and it first is the project economy, which is the rate of return and the economic lifetime. The economic lifetime is basically the length of the project or the power purchase agreement. It might be 20, 30 years. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that plants could actually, continue to do that. So the economic lifetime could actually be longer. But typically, when you're looking at the project itself, it's going to be defined by the length of the original power purchase agreement. Okay? Rate of return is the gain or loss on an investment over a specified period, expressed as a percentage, like 10%, 20%, 30%, 100%, 200%. We'd love that. Over the initial investment cost. Gains on investments are considered to be any income received from the security plus realized capital gains. Okay, and of course we will, go into that in more detail when we start talking about the financial, the capital, and economic dimension later on in the workshop. You also have to look at financial policy. What type of financing? Is it project? Is it trade? Is it alternative finance? Is it equity? Is it a grant? Is it a development loan? Okay. And then you have to look at the purchasing policy. What is the customer purchasing? Some may be just purchasing the power, for those 20 or 30 years. Some may choose for you to build it, just build it. Some may choose for you to build and operate and then transfer. Okay. Some, it could be a turnkey solution. Also, demands on local manufacturing. There's a need to know what has to happen locally to support this power plant. Okay. And, in places like Africa, that may be an issue, when you think of spare parts and all of those. So you're actually having to build an ecosystem around to ensure that the operation of your plant continues. Okay, so next we're going to look at environmental prerequisites, and I won't spend much time here. This is, a technical aspect, which, we really don't cover. We are going to look at doing some webinars, for those of you who want to understand more about the technical side if you don't. But just in this case, as it relates to the environmental prerequisites, related to SOx and NOx particulates, wastewater. There will be other environmental policies, either international or national and regional, that you may have to, basically work with. And then requirements on solid byproducts or waste. So a good example with coal is the coal ash. How is that managed? When you have, dozens of coal plants, that's a lot of ash. So, the example that I have currently is in the United States, is where our offices are in North Carolina. Duke Energy, it's the largest energy company in the United States, and may even be so in the world, actually. Maybe, I guess, by revenues or assets. But the problem is that the ash, they don't know what to do with it. So now they have people researching to look at different options so they can get rid of it. And obviously, that becomes an environmental hazard, or a nuisance. And so, this is something now with the environment and with, everything that people are looking at, typically these requirements are strengthening, meaning that you have to know what you're doing with those byproducts and what you're doing with that waste. And even if it's not the government, for example, some financiers in other places, they won't, because they look at the risk. This could be a risk. If you don't have a way to handle the byproducts and the waste, then, they may not fund because they can perceive that as too high of a risk. Okay, so environmental concerns are very important in this day and age. Operational prerequisites. There is the operation time. Is it 24/7? Is it 2 shifts, for example? Is it base load, consistent, or is it peak load? Availability factor, how often, or what percentage of time should it be available? Load change rate and minimum load. Okay, what is the minimum load you need? How often or how quickly does the load requirement change? Now, again, these are not necessarily things that you will know 100%, but you should have a general idea. And again, the project definition is very, very important to get your technical, like the big companies, the big partners, the EPCs, the financiers to even take a look or even talk to you. If you're just talking generalities, they really don't want to talk to you, and they won't, even really want to come on board. To be honest, most of the time they really want to look at something that's virtually, well defined and finished. The exception, of course, is when they're government tenders and they want to be a part of that process, and they consider you a good partner in that. Okay, so it's a very interesting dynamic, but basically the best advice I can give you concerning, pulling yourself together, pulling your project together, is really to begin as early as possible to detail these things. And again, the project definition document is the first outwardly written, or the written document, the first one that's written for the outside team or outside world. So other items you want to cover assumptions, things under which you're making the decisions on your project. For example, and it could, for example, be related to the energy source. We are assuming that we are going to be able to get, biomass within a 50 square mile radius of this quantity with, for example, if it's wood, with this level of moisture in it, so that we can produce 10 megawatts. Okay? You're putting down an assumption, even if you don't know it yet, but you're saying the conditions under which this project will be running. Then you look at the constraints, the things that keep you from being able to do it. Don't just put money down, okay? Everyone will say that, okay? You really need to be specific. Who are your key stakeholders that you already know of? The government, the community, the landowner, the technical team, the EPC, the operator. Do you have any of these people that you've talked to and have gotten some type of significant interaction with? And it would even be better if you could get a non-binding letter of interest from them concerning your project. Key legal regulatory policies. Every country, even some cities will have different regulatory policies. So you should be understanding what those are. Again, you're not the expert. You're not expected to be able to interpret it, but knowing the policies that affect your project is important. You want to identify risks. Again, one risk I mentioned earlier was the fact that, if you don't handle the environmental factor correctly, financiers won't necessarily want to touch it. Okay, even if the country, even if no one, raises a red flag, but, they may have heard suits, for the same issue somewhere else, and they will, it'll be a hands off. So those, you want to identify the risks, but what's important when you're listing the risk is not just to identify them, but to talk about how you're going to mitigate them. No one just likes to see a list of risks with no idea on how you're going to handle it. Okay? Critical success factors. In Africa, that can vary different from country to country. It's not just about the technical application and the price. It could be how many jobs are you creating? How much benefit are you giving to the community? Are you, for example, solving another problem, a waste problem, right? There's a project that I have with a group that's in another country, and with their biomass project, they're getting rid of an invasive species that's causing a huge hassle, and it's virtually impossible to get rid of it. Okay, so so those things can help you identify critical success factors, and that comes from really understanding your stakeholders, not just the internal workings of the project, but you need to understand the environment around you. You need to understand the ecosystem around you. You need to understand the stakeholders. And when you do that, you can identify, okay, if I'm going to get this project through, all 12, let's say, elements or people or stakeholders, it needs to have this characteristic. And those things become your critical success factors. Okay? Inclusions and exclusions. Basically, that's saying that there's some things that will be in the project and some things will not be. Okay? A government may say, okay, I want you to provide me 500 jobs, permanent jobs, not temporary jobs. And that is an inclusion in order for this project to work, and you have to figure out. And obviously, before you commit to that, you've already figured out, hopefully how you're going to do that. An exclusion, could be that, okay, we're providing, power to business, but we are not providing it to residential. Now, that's pretty a weak exclusion, but the idea is that you're basically saying this is definitely something we are not including in on this project. And then, of course, you always want to go back to the overall purpose, because the purpose is tied to the value proposition. What problem are you solving? Again, one of the problems that you might be solving is certainly the lack of energy, but, it might be in a place where there's a lot of pollution. So clean technology, renewable energy, using energy sources that are readily available, in on the earth. Okay. So it's beyond just the technical aspect. You want to be able to pull together something that communicates with not just one type of stakeholder, but with many different types of stakeholders. Okay, so let's now take a quick look at your assignment. Based on basically this last part that we talked about, you should draft your initial project definition document or review an existing one if you have an existing project. If you do not have an existing project, you can look for standard information for a country and an agency concerning things like environmental and financial policy. So, for example, you could look at the country of Cameroon, and you could find out what their rules are or which international agreements are in place related to the environment. You can then look, for example, what is their financial policy in the energy sector. So there are many things that you can begin to pull and look at. Now, admittedly, some of this information, depending on the country, will be on the web. Kenya actually has a very good document that explains the key, parts of the key agencies in the sector, the process to actually get, your project off the ground from the government perspective. And so it really depends on country to country. And but typically there's always going to be information that you cannot get off the web. So that means you're going to have to call and email. And if you are not local, it's actually even better if you're local or you're visiting to actually go to the building, see the people face to face and ask them for the information. But if you're emailing, oftentimes it is you won't necessarily get responses by email. Might get something but not get what you're looking for. So it's always a good policy to do follow-ups by phone, okay? Or, to call beforehand and say, particularly if you know the people, I need this information. I'm getting ready to send you an email. Will you look at it and will you get back to me? When can you get back to me? And again, it's just not leaving things. I'm big on follow-up. It's not just leaving things hanging and assuming that the others know and, will move like you move. You have to follow up in order to keep things moving and keep the momentum on your project. Okay? So again, I'm not going to review this page. It just talks about the practicum. Again, if you need any information from me, you can call me by phone, you can catch me on the website, and you can also send an email to info@afribiz.org. Have a great upcoming week. Thank you for this time, and I look forward to our next session.